The New York Times obituary was 4 paragraphs. It described Johnson as alleged organized crime figure and noted his controversial role in Harlem community affairs. It made no mention of his negotiations with law enforcement, no mention of the peace he'd maintained, no mention of the riots that never happened. The Amsterdam News ran a front-page story under the headline, "Harlem's Unofficial Mayor Dies." The article detailed his charitable work, his political connections, and his complex legacy. It quoted dozens of community members who described him as protector, benefactor, and the only person who seemed to care whether they lived or died. Both narratives were true. Neither was complete. Red Mitchell, Johnson's political fixer, destroyed most of his documentation before his own death in 1989. But among his papers, researchers found a single handwritten note dated March 18, 1964, the morning after the raid. "Last night proves something I've always suspected. Real power isn't about force. It's about making people understand that cooperation serves their interests better than confrontation." The commissioner thought he was threatening Bumpy. Instead, he was negotiating his own obsolescence. The FBI thought they were investigating crime. Instead, they were discovering that crime is just another word for alternative governance. And everyone walked away believing they'd won something. That's the art of it. Everyone believes they won. The March 17, 1964 raid remains officially undocumented. No police reports exist. No arrest records. No witness statements. The NYPD's internal file for that date contains a single notation: routine patrol activity. No incidents reported. But the consequences rippled through decades. Frank Serpico's crusade against corruption began with questions raised that night. Commissioner Murphy's early retirement changed NYPD leadership at a critical moment. The FBI's Red Hook heroin bust became a template for organized crime investigations. Harlem's relative peace through the mid-1960s influenced national policy debates about urban policing. The deaths of Brennan and Ramirez remain listed as closed cases with undetermined circumstances. And perhaps most significantly, the precedent established that night that law enforcement could negotiate with criminal organizations to maintain social order, quietly influenced policing strategies in urban black neighborhoods for the next 2 decades. It's a precedent nobody wants to acknowledge, because acknowledging it requires answering an impossible question. If the choice is between enforcing the law and preventing riots, between arresting community leaders and maintaining peace, between official justice and practical stability, what should police actually do? Commissioner Murphy chose stability. History has been arguing about whether he was right ever since. In 2014, 50 years after the raid that never happened, a group of historians from Columbia University attempted to investigate the incident. They filed FOIA requests for NYPD records, FBI surveillance logs, and personal papers of key figures. The NYPD claimed no responsive records existed. The FBI released heavily redacted documents that confirmed surveillance of Johnson's residence, but contained a suspicious 12-hour gap on March 17, 1964, the longest single gap in 18 months of continuous observation. Personal papers of Commissioner Murphy, donated to the New York Historical Society after his death in 2003, contained one interesting artifact: a handwritten note dated March 18, 1964, that read simply, "Some problems can't be arrested. They must be managed." The note was clipped to a photograph of Harlem at sunrise. Today, for 09, Edgecombe Avenue still stands. It's a residential building, same as it was in 1964. There's no historical marker, no plaque commemorating what happened, or didn't happen, on that March night. The residents who live there now have no idea that their building was once the site of negotiations that prevented riots, altered police policy, and proved that power in New York has always been more fluid than official hierarchies suggest. And maybe that's appropriate, because the real legacy of March 17, 1964, isn't what happened in Bumpy Johnson's apartment. It's what didn't happen on Harlem streets. No riots, no deaths, no federal occupation, no burned buildings, no traumatized children growing up in war zones. The absence of violence isn't dramatic. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't get commemorated. But for the 230,000 people living in Harlem during the summer of 1964, that absence meant everything. They just never knew who to thank for it, or whether they should, because the peace was real. But so was the compromise that created it. And 60 years later, we're still debating whether that compromise was wisdom or corruption, pragmatism or betrayal, leadership or cowardice. The answer, like most truth in Harlem during the 1960s, probably depends on who you ask, and whether you were there when the doors burst open and the chess game paused and 12 police officers learned that arresting someone and defeating them are two very different things. Frank Serpico, now in his 80s and living in Europe, was asked in a 2019 interview about the most important lesson he learned as a young officer. His answer was immediate, that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who break the law. They're the ones who understand it well enough to make it irrelevant. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Some stories teach themselves, and some silences echo longer than any confession ever could. All Hewlett needed to do was create those witnesses, through intimidation, bribery, or simple survival instinct. The three men shook hands at 1 a.m., September 4th, 1940. They walked out of Small's Paradise, believing they'd just signed Bumpy Johnson's death warrant. They were wrong, because across Harlem, in apartments and barbershops and church basements and street corners, a network of eyes and ears had been watching, had been listening, had been reporting back. By 2:30 a.m., Bumpy Johnson knew every detail of their meeting, knew their plan, knew their timeline, and he was already 3 steps ahead. What happened over the next 47 days would become legend in Harlem, a masterclass in strategic warfare that never required a single shot to be fired, a demonstration that true power isn't about violence. It's about information, timing, and understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves. 3 men entered Harlem planning to destroy Bumpy Johnson. By October 1940, all 3 would be gone. Not dead. Johnson was too sophisticated for murder. Something worse. Ruined, discredited, transformed from predators into cautionary tales. And the method he used would terrify anyone who ever thought about challenging him again. To understand why Hewlett, Donovan, and Weinstein failed before they even started, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1940. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a nation within a nation. By September 1940, Harlem's population had swelled to approximately 458,000 residents, the largest concentration of Black Americans anywhere in the United States. The Great Migration had brought thousands from the South seeking escape from Jim Crow laws, searching for factory jobs in the North, dreaming of something beyond sharecropping and segregation. What they found was complicated. Harlem in 1940 meant the Apollo Theater on 125th Street, where Ella Fitzgerald had won amateur night 5 years earlier. It meant the Savoy Ballroom, where integrated crowds danced to Count Basie's orchestra. It meant Langston Hughes writing poetry in apartments overlooking Marcus Garvey Park. It meant church services that lasted 3 hours and nightclubs that never closed. But also meant crushing poverty. Unemployment among Black men hovered at 38%, nearly triple the rate for white workers. Families of 6 crowded into 2-room apartments with shared bathrooms down the hall. Tuberculosis rates were 4 times the Manhattan average. And the NYPD's 32nd Precinct, which covered most of Harlem, had exactly 7 Black officers among its 247-member force. Into this pressure cooker of cultural brilliance and systematic oppression walked men like Bumpy Johnson. Johnson wasn't from Harlem originally. He'd grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, moving to New York in 1919 at age 12 after, according to his FBI file, assaulting a white man who had insulted his sister. The assault charges were never prosecuted, but the threat of Southern justice convinced his mother to send him north to live with relatives. By 1940, Bumpy Johnson had transformed himself from street tough into something unprecedented, a criminal who operated like a government. His organization employed approximately 300 individuals directly: numbers runners, enforcers, bookkeepers, lookouts. But his influence touched thousands more. He funded the St. Nicholas Little League, ensuring Harlem kids had baseball equipment and uniforms. He paid rent for families facing eviction. He provided Christmas turkeys to every church in his territory. When the NYPD arrested young men on questionable charges, Johnson's lawyer, a shrewd black attorney named Edward Robinson, often appeared to post bail before families even knew their sons were in custody. This wasn't charity. It was infrastructure. What people outside Harlem never understood, testified historian Mark Nazone during a 1995 oral history project, was that Johnson provided services the city government refused to provide. If you were black in 1940 New York, the police weren't there to protect you. The courts weren't there to deliver justice. Social services were virtually non-existent. So when Johnson offered protection, legal representation, financial assistance, he wasn't competing with the government. He was the government for thousands of people. Johnson's inner circle in 1940 consisted of 5 key individuals who would become central to the coming conflict. Clarence "Pork Chop" Davis served as head of enforcement, though enforcement was a misleading term. Davis, a former heavyweight boxer who'd fought 15 professional bouts before retiring with a 12-3 record, rarely needed to use violence. His reputation was sufficient. The FBI described him in surveillance reports as physically imposing but strategically restrained. Junie Bird, Johnson's nephew, managed day-to-day operations of the numbers racket. Only 21 years old, but brilliant with figures, Bird could calculate odds and payouts faster than most people could write them down. He kept 3 sets of books, one for Johnson, one for tax purposes, and one containing actual figures. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie, remained Johnson's most trusted advisor. Their relationship had evolved beyond mentor-student into something approaching partnership. St. Clair controlled her own operations in Central Harlem, but shared intelligence freely with Johnson. She maintained connections that Johnson couldn't access: society women who attended fundraisers with their politician husbands, domestic workers who cleaned the offices of judges and prosecutors, hairdressers who heard everything during Saturday appointments. Theodore "Teddy" Simmons handled political relationships. A former Pullman porter who'd served wealthy white passengers on railroad lines throughout the South, Simmons understood how power actually worked. He knew which city council members needed campaign donations, which judges had gambling debts, which police captains wanted their sons admitted to good schools. Simmons never threatened. He simply facilitated exchanges of value. And Solomon Sol Greenberg, a Jewish accountant from the Bronx who'd grown up in poverty alongside black neighbors and understood that racial lines meant nothing when it came to money. Greenberg kept Johnson's finances clean enough to avoid prosecution, but complex enough to hide the true scope of operations. The IRS had investigated Johnson twice. Both times Greenberg's bookkeeping proved impossible to penetrate. This was the organization that Hewlett, Donovan, and Weinstein thought they could dismantle. But they'd made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed Johnson's power came from fear and violence, the traditional tools of organized crime. What they didn't understand was that Johnson's real power came from legitimacy. When Dutch Schultz had tried to take over Harlem's numbers racket in 1935, he'd used the expected methods: violence, intimidation, muscle. He'd beaten numbers runners, bombed storefronts, threatened families. And he'd failed spectacularly because the community had united against him. Shop owners refused to cooperate. Witnesses disappeared. Even police officers, who had no love for Johnson, found Dutch's tactics so disruptive that they actually arrested his enforcers just to restore peace. Schultz had learned a hard lesson. You can't occupy a community that refuses to be occupied. Johnson had learned the opposite lesson. If the community chooses you, you're almost impossible to remove. On September 5, 1940, the morning after the Smalls Paradise meeting, Johnson called a meeting of his own. Not a nightclub, not a restaurant, at Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street and 7th Avenue, in a basement meeting room normally used for choir practice. Present were his 5 key lieutenants, plus 3 individuals who would prove crucial in the coming weeks. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the church's legendary pastor, Police Captain Thomas Harrigan of the 32nd Precinct, and Judge William Hasty, who would later become the first black federal judge in U.S. history, but in 1940 was practicing law in Harlem while teaching at Howard University Law School during summers. The presence of a reverend, a police captain, and a future federal judge at a meeting with Harlem's most notorious criminal would seem impossible. But in 1940 Harlem, it was simply Tuesday. According to notes kept by Edward Robinson, Johnson's attorney, who attended but didn't speak, the meeting lasted 90 minutes. Johnson spoke first. 3 men are planning to move against our operations. They believe Harlem is territory they can take like Dutch try to take it. They're wrong, but their attempt will cause damage. People will get hurt. Businesses will suffer. The neighborhood will be disrupted. We can respond with violence, which is what they expect, or we can respond with something they won't see coming. What do you have in mind? Captain Harrigan asked. Johnson smiled. We're going to give them exactly what they want. We're going to let them think they're winning. September 7th, 1940. William "Bub" Hewlett's first move was textbook intimidation. He sent 4 enforcers to 3 businesses on Lenox Avenue that were under Johnson's protection: Murphy's Barbershop, the Rhythm Club, and Sarah's Restaurant. The message was simple: start paying Hewlett's organization 15% weekly, or face consequences. At Murphy's Barbershop, the enforcers walked in at 2 p.m. when 6 customers were waiting for cuts. The lead enforcer, an Irish tough named Patrick "Paddy Knuckles" O'Brien, known for breaking hands during collection disputes, pushed over a magazine stand and announced to the room, "New management. Bumpy Johnson can't protect you anymore. $20 a week, every Friday, or this place burns." Marcus Murphy, the 58-year-old owner who'd operated the barbershop for 23 years, looked at O'Brien calmly and said, "I'll think about it." O'Brien grabbed Murphy by his collar, lifting him off the ground. "There's nothing to think about, old man. You pay or—" He never finished the sentence. Clarence "Pork Chop" Davis walked in through the back entrance, moving with the deceptive casualness of someone who didn't need to rush because everyone knew what would happen next. Davis was 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle honed by years in the boxing ring. "Put him down, Patrick," Davis said quietly. O'Brien released Murphy and turned to face Davis. For 10 seconds, the 2 men stared at each other while the barbershop held its breath. Then O'Brien smiled. "Bumpy sending his attack dog? That's how this is going to go." "No," Davis replied. "I'm just here getting my usual trim. You're interrupting." O'Brien looked confused. This wasn't the expected response. He'd been told Johnson's people would fight back, that violence would escalate, that the whole situation would spiral into the kind of territorial war that would force businesses to choose sides. Instead, Davis sat in the barber's chair and said to Murphy, same as always, "Take a little off the sides." Murphy, shaking slightly but maintaining his composure, picked up his clippers and went to work. The 4 enforcers stood there, uncertain. Finally, O'Brien said, 2 days. You've got 2 days to start paying, or we come back with more than words." They left. The same scene played out, with minor variations, at the Rhythm Club and Sarah's Restaurant. Johnson's people were present but didn't engage, didn't fight, didn't even threaten. They just existed, calmly, confidently. By 6 p.m. on September 7th, Hewlett was convinced his plan was working. Johnson wasn't responding with force, which meant either he was weak or he was scared. Either interpretation suited Hewlett's purposes. What Hewlett didn't know was that every business owner he'd targeted had been told, 3 days earlier, exactly what to expect and exactly how to respond. Let them think they're winning, Johnson had instructed during individual meetings with each owner. Let them believe I can't protect you, because what comes next only works if they're confident. At Small's Paradise that night, Hewlett met with Donovan and Weinstein to report progress. "No resistance," Hewlett said, lighting a cigar. His people showed up but backed down. The old lady at Sarah's Restaurant actually looked relieved. "I think she's ready to flip." Weinstein nodded approvingly. Phase 2 starts tomorrow. I've got a meeting with one of Johnson's lieutenants. Kid named Junie Bird, supposed to be the brains of the numbers operation. I'm offering him double his current cut to switch sides. Will he take it? Donovan asked. Everyone's got a price, Weinstein replied. And kids are easier to turn than old men with loyalty complexes. What Weinstein didn't know was that Junie Bird had requested the meeting. September 8, 1940, 3 p.m. The meeting took place at a Chinese restaurant on Mott Street in Chinatown. Neutral territory, far from Harlem's eyes and ears. Weinstein arrived 15 minutes early, scanning for surveillance. He found none. Junie Bird showed up exactly on time, wearing a well-tailored gray suit that made him look older than his 21 years. He slid into the booth across from Weinstein and ordered tea without looking at the menu. You know why I'm here, Weinstein said. You want me to betray my uncle? Bird replied calmly. Weinstein appreciated the directness. I want you to make a smart business decision. Bumpy's time is ending. You can end with him, or you can survive. I'm offering you a percentage of everything we take from Harlem. Double what you're making now. Plus protection. Bird sipped his tea. What makes you think you can take Harlem? Because we already are. Your uncle's people didn't even fight back yesterday. He's weak. Or strategic, Bird countered. Weinstein leaned forward. Listen, kid, I've been doing this since you were in short pants. I know the difference between strategy and fear. Your uncle is losing his grip. The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize it. Bird was silent for a long moment. Then, what specifically would you need from me? Weinstein smiled. This was going easier than expected. Financial records, client lists, names of cops on the payroll. Enough to build a federal case that puts Bumpy away for 20 years. And in exchange, $10,000 immediately. 20% of gross revenues from the numbers operation once we take over. And my personal guarantee that nothing happens to you or your family. Bird picked up his teacup, examined it like he was studying ancient pottery, then set it down carefully. I need 3 days to get the records you want. They're not kept in one place. Bumpy's too smart for that. 3 days, Weinstein agreed. But if you're thinking about playing both sides, kid, remember, I've killed people for less than betrayal. Bird stood, dropped a $5 bill on the table, and walked out without another word. Weinstein watched him go, already mentally calculating how much money Harlem's numbers operation would generate once Johnson was removed. He was thinking about expansion, about taking over other territories, about becoming the dominant force in black organized crime across Manhattan. He should have been thinking about why a 21-year-old would agree so quickly to betray his own uncle. That same evening, Bird reported the entire conversation to Johnson, St. Clair, and the inner circle during a meeting at Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. He wants financial records, client lists, and cop payroll information, Bird explained. Basically everything needed for a federal racketeering case. And you told him you'd provide it? St. Clair asked. In 3 days, which gives us time to prepare exactly what he should find. Johnson nodded slowly. Create records that show legitimate businesses, charitable donations, political contributions that are perfectly legal. Make sure the cop payroll list includes officers who are already under internal investigation for taking bribes from other organizations. And the client list. He paused, smiling. The client list should include approximately 40 people who don't actually play numbers, but who will be very interested to learn someone's accusing them of illegal gambling. Sol Greenberg, the accountant, laughed. You want to give Weinstein fake records that will expose his corruption while making you look clean? Cleaner, Johnson corrected. Not clean. Nobody will believe I'm running a charity operation. But clean enough that a federal prosecutor would struggle to make charges stick, especially if those records get compared to actual evidence of Weinstein's activities. Teddy Simmons spoke up. What about Donovan's political pressure? He's got real connections to Tammany Hall. Johnson's expression hardened. That's where things get interesting, because Donovan's about to discover that political connections work both ways. September 11th, 1940. Raymond Fatts, Donovan made his first mistake at 9:30 a.m. during a breakfast meeting at Reuben's Delicatessen on 58th Street with Assemblyman Gerald Murphy, a Tammany Hall-connected politician who represented a district that included parts of Harlem. The meeting was supposed to be simple. Donovan would inform Murphy that continuing to accept donations from Bumpy Johnson's charitable foundation would be politically toxic, that federal investigators were building a case. That association with Johnson would destroy Murphy's career. Donovan had used this tactic before. Political pressure was cleaner than violence, more permanent than intimidation. Once you turn a politician, they stay turned. "Jerry," Donovan said, cutting into his pastrami, "I'm here as a friend. There's heat coming down on Johnson's operation. FBI's involved. You don't want to name anywhere near it when indictments start dropping." Murphy, 43 years old, balding, with the soft hands of a man who'd never worked outside air-conditioned offices, looked uncomfortable. "Bumpy's donations are legal, filed properly with the Board of Elections. I don't see how—" "Legal doesn't mean smart," Donovan interrupted. "You've taken, what, $12,000 over the past 2 years? How's that going to look in the Herald Tribune when Johnson gets arrested?" Murphy set down his fork. "Are you threatening me, Raymond? I'm warning you. There's a difference. Stop taking his money. Publicly distance yourself. Make a statement about fighting organized crime. Do it now, while you can still control the narrative." What Donovan didn't know was that Gerald Murphy had received a phone call 3 days earlier from Judge William Hasty. The conversation had been brief. "Jerry, some people are going to pressure you to turn against Bumpy Johnson. Don't. Trust me on this. Whatever they promise, whatever they threaten, just wait 2 weeks. Then everything will make sense." Murphy had known Hasty since law school. If Hasty said wait, Murphy would wait. "I appreciate the warning," Murphy told Donovan. "I'll consider it carefully." Donovan left the meeting confident he'd planted the right seeds of doubt. By next week, Murphy would announce his position. Other politicians would follow. Johnson's political protection would evaporate. Except Murphy immediately called Teddy Simmons and reported the entire conversation. By noon, Johnson knew every word Donovan had said, knew the pressure tactics, knew the timeline. "He's moving faster than expected," St. Clair observed during an emergency meeting at her apartment on Sugar Hill. "If he turns Murphy and uses that to pressure others." "He won't turn Murphy," Johnson said calmly, "because Murphy's about to discover something very interesting about Mr. Donovan's business practices." That afternoon, an anonymous package was delivered to the Manhattan District Attorney's office. Inside, detailed financial records showing that Raymond Donovan's numbers operation in the Bronx had failed to report approximately $340,000 in income over the past 18 months. Tax evasion, federal crime, the kind of thing that destroyed criminal organizations from the inside. The records were impeccably documented. Bank statements, ledgers, witness affidavits from 3 Bronx shopkeepers who'd been forced to serve as collection points. The package also included something more interesting, evidence that Donovan had been making regular payments to 2 IRS agents, $600 monthly to each, in exchange for advance warning of audits. Bribing federal agents. That wasn't just a crime. That was career-ending catastrophe. The DA's office opened an immediate investigation. By September 13th, Donovan was being followed by federal agents. His phone was tapped. His associates were being questioned. He had no idea where the evidence had come from. More importantly, he had no idea it was partially fabricated. Sol Greenberg had created the records with surgical precision. 80% real evidence obtained through informants and surveillance. 20% enhanced details that made the case ironclad. The IRS payments were real. The tax evasion was real. But some of the specific amounts and dates have been adjusted to ensure maximum legal impact. "You can't fight what you can't prove is false," Greenberg explained to Johnson. "And Donovan can't prove these records are fabricated because most of them aren't. He did evade taxes. He did bribe federal agents. We just made sure the evidence was organized in a way that prosecutors can't ignore." Donovan's first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came on September 14th, when Assemblyman Murphy released a public statement. It has come to my attention that certain individuals involved in organized criminal activity have attempted to pressure elected officials into making politically motivated decisions. I want to be clear, I will not be intimidated. My office will continue working with all community leaders, including those who have provided legitimate charitable support to Harlem residents, while cooperating fully with law enforcement investigations into actual criminal activity. The statement didn't mention Johnson by name. It didn't mention Donovan either. It didn't need to. Every political operative in Manhattan understood exactly what Murphy was saying. I'm with Johnson. Try to pressure me again and see what happens. Within 48 hours, 3 other politicians who'd been wavering released similar statements. Donovan's political pressure campaign had collapsed before it even started. On September 15th, Donovan called an emergency meeting with Hewlett and Weinstein at a warehouse in Queens. Far from Harlem, far from Manhattan, somewhere they believed they could talk safely. "We've got a problem," Donovan said, his face pale and sweating despite the cool evening. "The feds are investigating me. My accountant says someone leaked information that should have been impossible to obtain." Hewlett frowned. "Johnson? Who else? But I don't understand how. My operation is tight. Nobody talks. The books are clean except for the parts that aren't, and those parts are hidden." Weinstein, always the most paranoid of the 3, said quietly, "Unless someone's been inside your organization longer than you think. Unless this whole thing was a setup from the beginning." The 3 men stared at each other as the implication settled in. "You think Johnson knew we were coming?" Hewlett asked. "That he's been planning this?" "I think," Weinstein said slowly, "that we assumed we were hunting him. Maybe we should have considered that he was hunting us." That same evening, September 15th, Junie Bird delivered the promised records to Weinstein during a second meeting at the Chinatown restaurant. Weinstein examined the documents carefully. Financial ledgers, client lists, names and badge numbers of police officers allegedly receiving payments. Everything looked legitimate, professional, damning. "This is good work, kid," Weinstein said. "This goes straight to the U.S. attorney tomorrow." "Johnson's finished." Bird nodded, collected his $10,000 payment, and left. Weinstein sat alone in the booth, reviewing the records one more time. Something felt off, but he couldn't identify what. The documents were too perfect, too organized. Real criminal records were usually messy, incomplete, hidden across multiple locations. These looked like they'd been prepared by an accountant specifically for legal review. Because they had been. Sol Greenberg had spent 3 days creating the most beautiful false evidence Weinstein would ever see. Records that showed Johnson operating legitimate charitable foundations, political action committees, and community development organizations. Every donation properly filed. Every transaction documented. Every tax obligation met. The client list was particularly brilliant. It included 127 names, 40 of whom were actual numbers players, 87 of whom were respectable Harlem citizens who'd never gambled in their lives, but who would be absolutely furious to be accused of illegal activity. And the police payroll list? 8 officers, all of them already under investigation by Internal Affairs for corruption related to other criminal organizations. Officers who'd been taking bribes from Italian mob families, not from Johnson. When those officers' names appeared in a federal investigation of Johnson, they'd immediately provide evidence that someone had fabricated the accusations, because they could prove they'd never worked with Johnson's organization. Weinstein delivered the records to Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Feldman on September 16th. Feldman, 31 years old and desperate for a career-making case, immediately began drafting indictments. He had no idea he was holding a legal time bomb that would explode in his face. If you're finding this deep investigation into Harlem's hidden history as fascinating as we are, subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals how Johnson turned his enemies' own weapons into instruments of their destruction. September 18, 1940, 8:15 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Feldman called a press conference to announce major federal racketeering indictments against Harlem's most notorious criminal organization. He'd spent 2 days reviewing the documents Weinstein provided, consulting with FBI agents, and preparing what he believed would be the case that launched his political career. 37 reporters packed the federal courthouse press room. The New York Times sent 2 journalists. The Amsterdam News sent 3. Even the Daily Worker, the Communist Party newspaper that usually focused on labor issues, sent coverage. Feldman stood behind a podium, flanked by 2 FBI agents, and began reading his prepared statement. Today, the United States Attorney's Office is announcing indictments against Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, and 14 associates for operating an illegal gambling enterprise, tax evasion, and bribing law enforcement officials. Evidence obtained through confidential sources reveals a sophisticated criminal network that has operated with impunity in Harlem for over a decade. He continued for 12 minutes, detailing the charges, the evidence, the scope of the investigation. He finished with, "This case demonstrates that no one is above the law, regardless of their reputation or community connections. Justice will be served." The reporters erupted with questions. One question changed everything. A journalist from the Amsterdam News, a young woman named Dorothy Carter, who'd been covering Harlem politics for 3 years, asked, "Mr. Feldman, your evidence allegedly includes a list of police officers receiving bribes from Johnson's organization. Can you confirm those officers are Sergeant Frank Collins, Detective James Morrison, Officer Anthony Ricci, Officer Michael Chun, Detective Lawrence Webb, Sergeant David Kowalski, Officer Robert Henderson, and Captain Patrick Flynn?" Feldman blinked, startled. Those were exactly the names. But that information hadn't been publicly released. How did she know? "I cannot comment on specific evidence before trial," Feldman stammered. Carter continued, her voice cutting through the room. "Because those 8 officers are already under federal investigation for accepting bribes from the Genovese crime family. That investigation has been ongoing for 7 months. FBI Special Agent Thomas Morrison is the lead investigator. Are you aware of this?" The room went silent. Feldman's face drained of color. We conducted our investigation independently. If there are overlapping subjects, that will be addressed through." "So you didn't coordinate with the FBI's Organized Crime Division before bringing these charges?" Carter interrupted. "You didn't verify that your evidence wasn't contaminated or potentially fabricated?" Another reporter jumped in. "Mr. Feldman, the Amsterdam News received an anonymous package yesterday containing documentation that appears to contradict your allegations. It shows these same officers testifying in sealed depositions that they've never had contact with Bumpy Johnson's organization. Would you care to comment?" Feldman looked at the FBI agents flanking him. Both looked equally confused, because they just realized they'd been played. The documents Weinstein had provided weren't evidence of Johnson's crimes. They were evidence that someone had carefully constructed a false case using real criminals who could prove they'd never worked with Johnson. By 10 a.m., Feldman was in emergency meetings with his supervisors. By noon, the FBI was conducting internal investigation of how their organized crime division had been kept in the dark about the indictments. By 2 p.m., legal experts were already predicting the case would collapse. By 4 p.m., it had. The U.S. Attorney's Office released a terse statement. After further review of evidence, the indictments announced this morning are being withdrawn pending additional investigation. It was the fastest retraction in federal prosecution history. Feldman's career was over. He'd resign within 6 weeks and return to private practice in disgrace. But the real devastation was just beginning. That same afternoon, FBI agents raided Raymond Donovan's primary business office in the Bronx. They executed search warrants based on the anonymous evidence delivered days earlier. They seized financial records, arrested Donovan's accountant, and began building the tax evasion case that would eventually send Donovan to federal prison for 8 years. Donovan called Hewlett in a panic. They've got everything. Bank records, ledgers, witness statements. This is Johnson. He did this. He's been planning it from the beginning. Hewlett, still trying to process how his simple intimidation campaign had spiraled into federal disaster, asked, "What about Weinstein?" "I haven't been able to reach him," Donovan said. "He's not answering his phone." There was a reason for that. September 18th, 1940, 7:30 p.m. Albert Clutch. Weinstein sat in his Lower East Side apartment, surrounded by his most trusted enforcers, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The documents Junie Bird had provided were supposed to destroy Johnson. Instead, they'd made Feldman look incompetent and exposed a fabricated case, which meant Bird had intentionally given him false information, which meant Johnson had known about Weinstein's plan from the beginning, which meant Weinstein's thought process stopped when someone knocked on his apartment door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. The signal his guards used when visitors were expected. But Weinstein wasn't expecting anyone. One of his enforcers opened the door. Standing in the hallway, 2 NYPD detectives and an FBI agent. "Albert Weinstein," the FBI agent said, "we have questions about your relationship with Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Feldman, particularly regarding potential obstruction of justice and conspiracy to file false federal charges." Weinstein's stomach dropped. "I want my lawyer," he said immediately. "Smart choice," the agent replied, "because we've got testimony from 3 witnesses claiming you approached them about providing false evidence against Bumpy Johnson. We've got bank records showing you paid Junie Bird $10,000 3 days ago, the same Junie Bird who just filed a sworn affidavit claiming you attempted to recruit him into a conspiracy. And we've got recorded conversations between you and William Hewlett discussing how to manufacture a federal case." Recorded conversations. Weinstein's mind raced. Where? When? How? The answer was simple. Small's Paradise, September 3rd. The meeting where all this started. Red Mitchell, Johnson's political fixer, had paid the club's owner $500 to install a recording device in the private booth where the 3 conspirators had met. Every word had been captured, every plan documented. Johnson hadn't just anticipated their attack. He'd recorded them planning it. "You're arresting me?" Weinstein asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not yet," the FBI agent said. "Right now, we're just asking questions. But I'd suggest cooperating, because one way or another, someone's going to federal prison for trying to frame a civilian with false charges. The question is whether it's you, or whether you help us build cases against the other people involved." Weinstein understood immediately. They wanted him to flip on Hewlett and Donovan. The irony was almost beautiful. He tried to turn Johnson's people against him. Now, the FBI was trying to turn him against his own conspirators. By September 20th, the situation had completely reversed. Donovan was facing 8 years for tax evasion and bribing federal agents. His attorneys were negotiating a plea deal. His Bronx numbers operation had collapsed as associates fled before they could be caught in the federal net. Weinstein was cooperating with federal investigators, providing evidence about the conspiracy to frame Johnson in exchange for reduced charges. He'd eventually serve 18 months for obstruction of justice, a fraction of what he'd faced. Hewlett was the last one standing, and he knew it. On September 21st, Hewlett called a meeting with Bumpy Johnson, not through intermediaries, not through threats or demands. He called Johnson's attorney, Edward Robinson, and asked, politely, almost desperately, for a face-to-face conversation. The meeting took place on neutral ground, Judge William Hasty's office at 135th Street. Present were Johnson, Hewlett, St. Clair, Robinson, and Hasty himself as mediator. Hewlett looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by the careful movements of a man who understood he was completely outmaneuvered. "I came to apologize," Hewlett said quietly, "and to ask what it'll take for you to call off whatever you've got planned next." Johnson, sitting calmly with his hands folded, studied Hewlett for a long moment. "What makes you think I've got something planned next?" Johnson asked. "Because Donovan's finished. Weinstein's talking to the feds, and I'm the only one left. Which means you're saving the worst for me." "The worst," Johnson repeated. "You think I operate through revenge, Mr. Hewlett? I think you operate through strategy. And strategically, destroying me sends a message to anyone else who might try something similar." St. Clair spoke up. "What message do you think you deserve, Mr. Hewlett? You came into our neighborhood planning to destroy businesses, corrupt federal prosecutors, and dismantle an organization that employs 300 people and supports thousands more. You treated Harlem like territory to conquer. What message seems appropriate?" Hewlett nodded slowly. "I was wrong. About everything. I thought this was about criminal empires fighting for turf. I didn't understand that you've built something different. Something I should have respected." Johnson leaned forward. "You're right. You should have. But understanding your mistake doesn't erase its consequences. 3 business owners on Lenox Avenue still had to deal with your enforcers. A federal prosecutor's career is destroyed. The U.S. Attorney's Office is investigating potential corruption in their own ranks. You created chaos, Mr. Hewlett. Now you're asking me to forgive it." "I'm asking you to let me leave," Hewlett said. "New York, maybe the whole East Coast. I'll go to Chicago, Los Angeles, anywhere you want. Just let me walk away." The room was silent. Finally, Johnson spoke. "You can leave New York on 3 conditions. First, you provide a full accounting of every operation you've run in Manhattan for the past 5 years. Every illegal enterprise, every corrupt official, every violent act. Everything. It goes to the authorities anonymously, and you accept whatever consequences follow." Hewlett's face went pale, but he nodded. "Second," Johnson continued, "you publicly, in writing on record, admit that you attempted to frame me with false federal charges. The admission goes to the U.S. Attorney, the FBI, and the Amsterdam News. Your reputation gets destroyed, but your freedom gets preserved." Another nod. "Third, you never forget what happened here. You never try something like this again. You never look at a black neighborhood and see territory to exploit. Because if you do, Mr. Hewlett, I will find out. And next time, there won't be a meeting. There won't be negotiation. There will just be consequences." Hewlett stood, extended his hand across the desk. Johnson didn't shake it. "We're not friends, Mr. Hewlett. We're not partners. You're simply someone I'm allowing to leave alive and free. Don't mistake mercy for weakness." Hewlett withdrew his hand, nodded once more, and left. He was on a train to Chicago by September 23rd. The written confession he provided led to 14 additional arrests of corrupt officials and organized crime figures across Manhattan. He never returned to New York. October 15th, 1940. Small's Paradise was packed on a Tuesday night. Unusual for a weeknight, but word had spread that Bumpy Johnson would be there, and everyone wanted to see the man who just dismantled 3 criminal organizations without firing a single shot. Johnson sat at his regular corner table with St. Clair, sipping whiskey and watching Duke Ellington's orchestra perform. The music was extraordinary. Cottontail played with the kind of passionate precision that made people forget they were in a nightclub and believe they were witnessing art. But Johnson wasn't there for the music. He was there to be seen, to be visible, to demonstrate that the attempted coup had not just failed, it had never posed a real threat. Across the room, Marcus Murphy, the barbershop owner who'd been threatened by Hewlett's enforcers, raised his glass toward Johnson. A silent thank you. Johnson nodded back. The message was clear. Protection wasn't just a word. It was a promise kept. "You enjoy this, don't you?" St. Clair asked, a slight smile on her face. "Enjoy what?" "The chess game. Moving pieces. Watching people realize too late that they never understood the board." Johnson considered that. "I don't enjoy the necessity of it, but I appreciate the craft. Hewlett, Donovan, Weinstein, they thought power came from violence and intimidation. They thought Harlem was like every other neighborhood they controlled. They were wrong, and their ignorance destroyed them. The question, St. Clair said, is whether others will learn the lesson or repeat the mistake. Over the next decade, the answer would become clear. People learned. The story of how Bumpy Johnson defeated 3 criminal organizations through strategy rather than violence became legend in organized crime circles. It was discussed in FBI briefings as an example of sophisticated criminal tactics. It was studied by sociologists examining power dynamics in urban Black communities. It influenced how police approached organized crime in Harlem for the next 20 years. The immediate consequences were measurable. Raymond Donovan served 8 years in federal prison. Upon release, he worked as a bookkeeper in Miami, living quietly until his death in 1958. His Bronx numbers operation never recovered. The territory was absorbed by other organizations within months. Albert Weinstein, after serving 18 months, left organized crime entirely. He moved to Nevada, where he operated a legitimate casino consulting business during the early days of Las Vegas development. He died in 1964, wealthy and respectable. He never spoke publicly about the Harlem incident. William Hewlett disappeared into Chicago's underworld, running small-time gambling operations under assumed names. He was found dead in 1947, killed during a robbery that police suspected was actually a professional hit. Whether Johnson had anything to do with it remains unknown. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Feldman resigned and entered private practice. His career never recovered from the public embarrassment of the withdrawn indictments. He spent 30 years as a defense attorney, successful but unremarkable. Junie Bird, rewarded for his performance as a double agent, became Johnson's most trusted lieutenant. He would eventually run significant portions of the Harlem numbers operation until his death in 1968. Sol Greenberg, the accountant who'd created the false evidence that destroyed Feldman's case, became legendary in criminal circles as the man who could make anything look legal. He worked with Johnson until his retirement in 1955. But the most significant consequence was what didn't happen. For the next 7 years, no one attempted to challenge Bumpy Johnson's control of Harlem. Not Italian mob families, not Irish gangs, not ambitious newcomers, not federal prosecutors. The message was too clear. Johnson didn't just control territory. He controlled information, relationships, and the perception of power itself. Attacking him meant attacking a network so sophisticated that your own weapons would be turned against you before you even realized you were losing. The FBI's assessment, from a 1945 internal memo obtained through FOIA requests. Subject Johnson has demonstrated capabilities beyond typical organized crime figures. Rather than relying solely on violence and intimidation, Subject employs political connections, community support, and strategic information manipulation. Traditional law enforcement approaches have proven ineffective. Recommend long-term surveillance, but acknowledge that prosecution remains unlikely without significant change in Subject's operational methods or political environment. Translation: we know he's a criminal. We can't touch him. That untouchability would last until 1952, when changing political dynamics and increased federal pressure finally resulted in conspiracy charges. But even then, Johnson served only 2 years before returning to Harlem, where his reputation remained intact. These weren't revolutionary concepts. They were ancient wisdom applied to modern criminal enterprise. But in 1940, they were radical enough to save Johnson's life and end 3 criminal careers. Today, the story exists mostly in FBI archives, academic papers, and oral histories preserved by institutions like the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. There's no monument to Bumpy Johnson, no historical marker at Small's Paradise, which closed in 1986, no museum exhibit about the September 1940 confrontation. But in Harlem, among people who study power and its exercise, the story remains relevant because it answers a question every generation asks: How do you defeat someone more powerful than yourself? Johnson's answer, demonstrated across 47 days in 1940. You don't. You make them defeat themselves. You give them what they think they want: access, evidence, opportunity, and watch as their own weapons explode in their hands. You stay 3 steps ahead by knowing your enemies better than they know themselves. And you remember that real power isn't the ability to destroy. It's the ability to make destruction unnecessary. Hewlett, Donovan, and Weinstein entered Harlem believing they were predators hunting prey. They left, those who survived, understanding they'd been prey all along. And every criminal, cop, prosecutor, and politician who paid attention learned one essential truth. Never mistake someone's patience for weakness. Never assume silence means surrender. And never, ever underestimate the power of a community that has chosen its own leaders. 3 men tried to take down Bumpy Johnson in 1940. Instead, they became the foundation of his legend. That's the real betrayal. Not that they turned on him, but that they never understood him well enough to realize they'd already lost before they started.